Alright, so today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the nature of the chemical bond, and in particular what is called hybridization. This is probably the most difficult topic in the unit for sure, if not possibly the whole course. So I hope that you pay close attention and even re-listen to this recording if you need to. So if we look at our learning goal for today, you are going to, hopefully by the end of this and by the end of our work in class, be able to explain how hybrid orbitals are formed, and you should be able to predict the hybridization of a molecule based on its Lewis structure. So first thing is the valence bond theory. This was developed by Linus Pauling, and he basically said that a covalent bond is the overlap of two atomic orbitals to form a new combined orbital containing two electrons of opposite spin. So if I have two hydrogens here, each with one electron in the 1s orbital, so I got one electron in here and one electron here, when they actually bond together to make an H2 molecule, what ends up happening is these orbitals overlap, create sort of one big overlapping orbital with two electrons in it. Now there's a little mistake here, I don't know if it's in your notes, but we should have two electrons of opposite spins, so an arrow going up and an arrow going down. Alright, that electron density, so that spot, becomes concentrated between two nuclei when you have a shared pair of electrons. So here's another example, hydrogen fluoride. Here's your hydrogen, here's your fluorine. Here you have an S, an electron in the S subshell. For fluorine, you have an electron in the 2p subshell. They're going to come close together and overlap. And when they do, you get this big, huge orbital here with two electrons in it that are all moving around like crazy and spinning in opposite directions. Your hydrogen nucleus is sort of still over here. Your fluorine nucleus is over here. And that's what your covalent bond sort of looks like. There are some problems with this theory. Biggest one being that they are not capable of explaining bond angles. So let's look at water, the water molecule, as our first example. So if we look at your electron configuration for your oxygen atom, we have two electrons in the 1s, two electrons in the 2s, and four electrons in the 2p subshell. Okay? In that 2p subshell, we've got two shells that only have one electron in it, so each hydrogen with its one electron can kind of bond in there and create your H2O molecule. Perfect! When we draw it now, here are my hydrogens overlapping. Here's my oxygen. So your hydrogens overlap with your p orbitals of your oxygen. Perfect. So there's one bond there and there's another bond there, so it kind of looks like this. H-O-H, just like that. Okay. Which is okay except for the bond angle. So it says over here, the predicted bond angle using this valence bond theory is 90 degrees. We know that each of the p orbitals sit on the x, y, and z axes, which are all at 90 degrees to each other. So when we draw them at sort of a 90-degree angle to each other. But when we actually look at the angle experimentally, the measured angle between these two h's here is 105 degrees, not 90. So how is that possible? Well, the reason why it's possible is because of hybridization. So here is actually a nitrogen atom, and the really cool thing about electrons is that they have the ability to change shapes. Their orbitals can change shapes depending on what the atom needs to bond to. So for example, here's nitrogen. We've got a big S subshell here. Okay, the 1s subshell is here, but we're not gonna, I didn't draw that in for this diagram just to keep things simple. So that big circle is your 2s, and then you've got a p orbital here, another p orbital here, and another p orbital here. And they're all at 90-degree angles, okay? Depending on how many other elements nitrogen needs to bond to, this s and the 3p orbitals can kind of overlap and fuse to make new orbitals that are more energetically stable. So we're going to look at how carbon and hydrogen bond together. So here is your ground state electron configuration and your energy level diagram for carbon. Again, you got two electrons in the 1s, two electrons in the 2s, and two electrons in the 2p. Okay? We have an empty orbital here, and that's fine, that's stable, we've talked about that before. And I have two spots here where I could technically grab 2 electrons and they can share. Okay, so maybe those 2 electrons each come from a hydrogen. And what do we get? We get a CH2 molecule. Wonderful. That is definitely possible. We can have a CH2 molecule. Here's the thing. It's also possible for us to have a CH4 molecule. Well, if we look at my electron configuration, where am I going to get 2 extra electrons for these 2 extra hydrogens to bond to? The hydrogens can't bond here because that's already full. Sure as heck isn't going to bond in the 1s because that's not even a valence electron. So what happens? We're going to get the fusion of 2 orbitals, an s and a p orbital, to make what's called an sp hybridized orbital. So in a nutshell, what happens is an s orbital and a p orbital will fuse together to make a new sp hybridized orbital. Now I know this is very new for you. We're going to go through a bunch more examples so that hopefully you can understand. Alright, again, here are 3 carbon atoms. Here's a carbon, here's a carbon, here's a carbon. Okay? If we ignore hybridization completely, when they bond together, their orbitals overlap. So here's an overlap of one orbital, here's the overlap of another orbital. Okay? What you guys have to keep in mind is that in each of these orbitals are electrons. So, for example, here's a big huge s orbital that has an electron floating around and going all over the place in there. Okay? And each one of those p orbitals, each one of those lobes, have electrons in them that are floating all around and floating all around. So what ends up happening is here is too crowded. You have too much negative charge in this overall area because they're so close together. Whereas you have lots of space here where electrons would be much happier because they would be further apart from each other, so you'd have less repulsion. So in order for this crowded area to kind of spread itself out a little bit into this open space, we have to form what are called hybridized orbitals. Alright, so because chemistry, and specifically organic chemistry and biochemistry, deal a lot with carbon, we're going to focus on carbon to teach you about hybridization, and then we're going to look at other examples in class. So here is a carbon atom. Here is your electron configuration for carbon. 1s2, 2s2, 2p2. To get a hybridized orbital, what is actually going to happen is your 2s orbital and your 2p orbitals are going to fuse. This electron is going to get promoted. That's our new word. It's going to get promoted to the 2p orbital. So then what we end up with are 4 individual electrons in 4 separate orbitals that can each bond to, say, 4 different hydrogens. What do you end up with? This. So here again, here are my 4 separate electrons, with this one here being the one that got promoted. When that happens, they actually all fuse together and make 4 identical sp3 hybridized orbitals. So I no longer have 1s and 3 p's. I have 4 identical sp3 hybridized orbitals. And here's what they look like. Okay, this is a picture of one sp3 hybridized orbital. And this is what 4 of them together would look like over here. Why are they called sp3 hybridized orbitals? Because they're made up of 1s and 3 p's. 1s and 1, 2, 3 p's all fused together. Here's a little bit more what it looks like. From a 3D perspective, we're going to do a lab where you guys are going to build some 3D molecules, so you'll get a good glimpse of this. But now, because we have these sp3 hybridized orbitals, we don't have a 90-degree angle between our orbitals anymore. That angle here is now about 109.5 degrees. They're all equally spaced apart. We minimize your electron repulsion. Okay, so this lobe here and this lobe here are as far apart as they can be to minimize your electron repulsion. Alright, so here's your actual definition of a hybridization theory. There's a video here that I'm going to show you in class. So it proposes that atomic orbitals can combine to form new hybrid orbitals. I gave you one example in the last slide on sp3 hybrid orbitals. There are other ones. Hybrid orbitals then overlap with orbitals of other atoms to form covalent bonds. So hybridization is not a bond. It's just the revamping of orbitals so that it can make a bond with another atom. So here's an example. Combining a p orbital and an s orbital gives you two sp hybridized orbitals. They look like that. Those orbitals can now say bond with an s orbital from hydrogen, and that there is your covalent bond. So note, these orbitals are hybridized only when bonding. They do not exist in an isolated atom. So if I have carbon all by itself, I have one s and three p's. I have no hybridization. If I have carbon bonded to something else, I now have, in this case, I have 4 sp3 orbitals, and I do have hybridization happening. Here's another example of hybridization making sp2 orbitals. So, in this molecule here, CH2O, we're not going to have sp3 hybridized, we're going to have sp2 hybridized. Don't ask how I know that. I'm going to show that to you at the end. So in order for this to be sp2 hybridized, I had an electron in my 2s subshell, and it got promoted over to here. What's going to happen is 1s and 2 of the p orbitals, so say these two here, are going to fuse together to make an sp2 hybridized orbital, and I'm going to be left over with an electron all by itself in the p orbital. This is very important. So here's sort of what it looks like, okay? Here are my 3 identical sp2 hybridized orbitals. That's these guys here, sp2, sp2, and sp2. Again, we call them sp2 because it's a fusion of 1s and 2 p's. And I still have an electron left over all by itself in a p orbital. That's here in your dumbbell-shaped regular p orbital. Okay. Now at this point, I don't expect you to know why I made 3 sp2s and not 4 sp3s and all that. We're going to get there. So I just want to show you different examples of different hybridized molecules. Here's what the molecule actually looks like. So, again, I've got my carbon. Here's my carbon nucleus. I've got sp2 hybridized. Okay. Each of these sp2 hybridized orbitals will overlap with the 1s orbital from hydrogen. So here's your 1s orbital. So there's a covalent bond right there. Okay. This sp2 from carbon will also overlap with the sp2 from oxygen to make one of these bonds here. But we actually have a double bond between carbon and oxygen. That double bond comes from the overlap between the one remaining pi orbital. Looks like that. Okay, so again, here's my carbon, here's my oxygen, here are my hydrogens. If we look here, the first bond that's made between carbon and oxygen is what's called a sigma bond. It's the overlap of 2 sp2 hybrid orbitals. The second bond is what's called a pi bond. And that's this and this overlap together. So I know by looking at this diagram, it looks like there are 1, 2, 3 bonds between carbon and oxygen. That is not correct. The sigma bond in the middle, that's one bond, and the top and the bottom together make the second pi bond. Your angles in this case are 120 degrees. We're going to look at what that means later on when we do our lab. And last one I'm going to show you is an sp hybridized orbital, similar to the sp2. Again, we had some electrons in the 2s subshell of carbon. One got promoted over to here. and then one s and one p orbital fused together to make two identical sp hybridized orbitals. So here, that's one sp. Here's your other sp. I'm going to change my color of my marker so you can see it a little bit better. Okay, and then I'm left with two different electrons, each in a different p orbital. Those p orbitals are what's going to make my double and my triple bond. So if you look at the next slide, for this molecule, HCN, I've got my sigma bond in the middle. That's my overlapping of my sp hybridized orbitals. And then you can see the overlap of the green pi orbitals. That makes one bond. And the overlap of the yellow pi orbitals make the triple bond, the third bond. So the first bond that's made, or a single bond, is a sigma bond. And the other two are pi orbitals that overlap, and they make your double and triple pi bonds. All right, great. What about phosphorus pentachloride? What's the hybridization on this? So I've shown you three examples: sp3 hybridized, sp2 hybridized, and sp hybridized. What happens with phosphorus pentachloride? The hybridization on this, sp3d, which means that it's made up of one s, 3p, and one d orbitals all fused together. I end up with 5 identical orbitals, and that's how I get 5 bonds on my phosphorus. That's how I get an expanded octet. Now, how the heck did I know that? Good question. I'm going to jump ahead to the last slide for a second, and then I'll go back. To predict hybridization, first you have to draw the Vesper diagram, or the Lewis dot diagram of the molecule or the ion. Then you're going to count the number of bonds on the central atom, and double and triple bonds count as 1. So if I go back to my CH2O example, if I count the number of bonds, I've got one bond here, one bond here, and one bond here. And I already said double and triple bonds count as 1. So my total number of bonds in this molecule is 3. Add any non-bonding electron pairs. So if this carbon had 2 extra electrons kind of hanging off of it, then that would count and that would make it 4, but that's not the case. And then the total number that you get corresponds to the number of orbitals according to this chart here. So if I have 3 bonding pairs, that means I have an sp2 hybridized orbital. Where does the 3 come from? Well, it means I had one s and 2 p's fused together. 1 plus 2 is 3. If I only have 2 things bonded to my central atom, 1 s, 1 p, 1 plus 1 is 2. So if I count my number of bonds over here, and the answer is 2, I have sp hybridized orbitals. If I have 4, it's sp3, 1s plus 3 p's. If I have 5, it's sp3d, 1s, 3 p's, and 1 d. And if I have 6, it's 1s, 3 p's, and 2 d's. So now if I go back to my phosphorus pentachloride, you guys should all know how to draw these. Now, we did Lewis structures. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bonds, no extra electrons. So I have to have 5 orbitals in order for that to happen. 1s, 3p, 1d, sp3d1, or just sp3d. Here's what they actually kind of look like when we draw them out. Okay, I will never ask you to draw sp3d or sp3d2 hybridized orbitals, just because they do start to get complicated and that's hard to draw in 3D. But what happens again? You have a promotion and you end up with 5 electrons, each in identical hybridized orbitals called sp3d orbitals. Each one of these little lobes here are sp3d orbitals, and now they can bond to something sort of like chlorine and overlap and make a covalent bond. So here's your end result. We have some 120 degrees and 90 degrees, again to minimize electron-electron repulsion. We're going to talk about that more when we do the Vesper diagrams. So that's the end of today. We'll see you in class, and we'll work out lots of problems together.